Greetings, fellow keepers of the Lake of Creative Thinking. Today I want to talk to you about an interesting thing that I have never really thought about that much until I started working on my own game, and that is conditions and curses. Now hear me out, if you're just a GM going surfing through the web looking for the hot new mechanic or modification to their favorite system and they're not really into the design of these things that much, still I think you should stay, because we're gonna go into the fun part of this and how you can incorporate this in your game. So to do this, we first need to define what a condition is. So for me, a condition is any label that you put on things and that then changes how these things work for a prolonged period of time. You can remove this label and all the effects of that condition are removed as well. So in a lot of games, there is so much conditions that you have a specific page on the end of the book that goes over all the conditions that your character can get. It is really useful for modeling certain situations and also forcing characters into certain behaviors that then are explained by the condition's name, for example. What I'm trying to say is, if you're tired, your GM might give you an exhaustion condition. If you are then getting more and more exhausted, you can get like exhaustion number 2 and then just be incapacitated or sleepy or something. I have a personal taste when it comes to conditions where I don't like having too many conditions in the game happening at the same time. It's very hard for me to track that. I know you can buy those little circles, with conditions written on them and put that on the miniature, but sometimes these conditions are maybe longer lasting or it's damage over time, and I have to remember all these things. In our game, we decided that conditions are gonna be things that really change how your game is being played, and in that way they are like game modifiers. Now they can enforce certain thematic behavior, they can also be just a numerical thing, or they can be a very narrative thing. So I want to divide conditions into narrative and active conditions. Now, narrative conditions are those that don't change the game, they don't give you any bonuses or penalties, they're just there to narratively emphasize a certain thing about your character. A good example of this would be losing senses. I'm just saying that in some games it makes sense to just leave this as a narrative thing. What do I mean by this? When you're blind, you cannot see things, so now you have to roleplay this, and people that are coming in contact with you will make a comment on this. Now when you say in the middle of battle, I take my bow and I fire it, the GM and everyone will say, well, you don't see, so what do you fire? At this point it's a matter of luck, just roll. If you hit something, you have like 20% of chance. Like, you can now play around with how that is affected mechanically from situation to situation. Of course, you can add disadvantages, you can add this and that, but usually it's not something that I would consider like a thing that is always the same. Sometimes it would be easier, sometimes it will be harder to do things when you're blind. What happens with your hearing and other senses if you're blind? They get sharper. Do you apply those modifiers to all your other skills to match this? It would be too much. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's a narrative thing. You will handle it on situation by situation basis, and the world will respond to you having that condition. I would also say that some things that affect your look, for example, purple skin can be a condition. You have purple skin for a reason. Maybe you drank a shady potion in the back alley behind the magic shop. Now you're purple. So instead of fidgeting around with your charisma stat, why would you? You are purple. Everyone is gonna mention that you're purple. You're gonna have maybe some problems getting in places or doing things because of your purpleness. This is what I'm trying to say. Now the world will respond, and the world responding is already a type of like buff or debuff depending on the situation, right? So these are in the gray area, right? I'm saying there is no mechanical change, but what I'm actually saying is there is no consistent mechanical change. Yeah, that sounds better. Now, with that said, we can say that active conditions are the ones that have strict effects on your character, on your game, and could have a certain trigger for developing them further. If you're exhausted and you get more exhausted, well, you progress all the way to some form of unconsciousness, which is probably sleep, right? We don't just die when we're exhausted. I don't know, but you get the point. If you're familiar with how our game Redmark works, we have certain skills that you can boost with certain aspects. So we didn't want to explain exhaustion as, oh, you have a numerical penalty, but we said, okay, you cannot use one of your bonuses anymore until this is resolved. So instead of rolling a skill and 2 aspect dice, you can now roll only 1 aspect dice. When your exhaustion progresses, you can now roll only your skill roll. You cannot use aspect dice. Aspects are like things that specialize your character in a certain field, so what if you can't use one of those? Well, that could be amnesia, right? You hit your head, you forget things, so amnesia could be you losing a random aspect and you have to like slowly regain this ability. So then naturally we asked the question, okay, can we change something else? What about skills? Our game is a roll under system, so we asked what if there is a condition that makes you roll over the skill now? It's like a negative of your character. Maybe if you like are corrupted and join the dark side, maybe if you're dominated, for example, all of your skills become the negations of themselves. Interesting food for thought. Then we said, okay, if you are disoriented, you cannot use ranged attacks. If you are paralyzed, you cannot use any of the physical skills. We have 6 skills, 3 are physical, 3 are mental, so this is very easy to keep track of. If you get sick, for example, very sick, maybe you cannot heal over half of your HP until this is cleared, or you can also call this a certain like type of poison. So yeah, these are some ideas, but now let's look at curses and like negative things that your character might acquire through magic or whatever reason. Our game is a modern horror game and we do have a sort of like a act of supernatural. In our game it is void, we call it void, but there is different interpretations of void, where each interpretation of void will lead to a slightly different genre of play, genre of game. And one idea was, well, void represents the higher power, right? So if void represents the higher power and is inconceivable to our characters, it is a sort of very interesting horror topic to say that a certain NPC in the game was only created for the amusement of us around the table. Their whole life, all of their memories are created just for them to be eaten by goblins or orcs for our amusement. For us, that sounds really scary. If we look at the interpretation of void that says it's a higher power, then we can extrapolate that for our characters. We as the players are the void aspect, right? And then we have the GM that is sort of like a void thing to the players and their characters, and then you have the ultimate void, which is the dice, because we again circle back to the higher power of our universe. Luck is some sort of higher power extrapolated from chaos theory that for us is void. So we wanted to find a certain place in this whole system to put some of our conditions as curses. And we ended up saying that real world things that players do, things that the GM does, or things that the dice say can trigger a certain effect for the condition. Now we call these void touched conditions, but in other games they would be curses. And I think the most horrible curse that we came up with is called doomed. You roll a d10 when you acquire this condition. If you rolled 10, you're fine, the condition is cleared. But if you didn't roll a 10, this is now your doom number for a specific amount of time until this condition is cleared. If this number shows up on any of the dice that the other players roll, you will just instantly die. Just lose your character. I mean, it's a very hard one, I know, but this is the mechanic, right? You have your doom number, and when it shows up, something happens. If it's bad, players will try to avoid rolling dice so they keep you safe, and which is very interesting. And now when you're rolling those dice, everyone is very tense. This is what we want to achieve. Now we have sort of like an abstract way of keeping track of resources. It's just one number called the resource value. And we also have a thing that is called composure that measures how cool you are with the whole situation. It's basically sanity from Call of Cthulhu, but composure made more sense for our setting. And for example, if you have been humbled, now for a while your resource value can never be bigger than your sanity. If that happens, you might lose sanity or decide to give away resources. Now we can play with this idea of real-world triggering things. We had an idea to call this condition narcolepsy, but I don't know if it's gonna reach the print. I don't really like the name because of playing around with something that is a real problem for a lot of people, but The condition behind it was that if you yawn in real life, your character gets an exhaustion point. We also played around with players leaving the room, so we had a condition called ominous absence or you're being hunted. Just leaving the room triggers an encounter. Which encounter doesn't matter, how it will fit the story doesn't matter, just needs to happen. If they communicate to others that this will happen if they leave the room, they lose some composure and the status clears. So you can risk losing a lot of composure or leaving the room and knowing that an encounter will happen. Maybe this condition is something that your player doesn't know will result in an encounter. You can play around with it. Also, Midas Touch is just a classic curse. It wouldn't be fun to say that the touched character becomes golden and, but you can say that any of the items that they were holding when touched will turn to stone. How do you keep it interesting? Well, at one point, your players might touch each other in real life. Well, that's also a trigger. Why wouldn't it be? Now your character again gets something turned to stone that they are holding. I think even if they are not in the same room in game, maybe this is some void thing. I really like it because it dissolves the boundaries between the game and the real world, and curses do feel like that, right? They feel like they're like out of nowhere, like always observing us and doing their thing to make life harder. Another interesting one is called Parasitic Pact. Whenever you fail a roll, you can say that you instantly succeed, but a person next to you loses like 10 of composure or 10 luck or something, like some of those like alternative currencies that you have in the game, and then the condition clears. Now, will this spark an argument between the players? Well, of course it will, but that's the thing. Maybe the parasite that caused this thing to happen jumps to another player. Now it's payback time. We also had one called Dry Mouth. Whenever anyone at the table takes a sip from their drink, this character loses 1 composure. Again, something that they shouldn't communicate to others that they have, because then they would lose like a bunch of composure and then the status will be cleared. They can clear it by going and doing stuff in the world to clear it, but at this short amount of time they will be like cautious, and it will be interesting to see how they avoid the topic of like drinking things around the table. Will a lot of these be fun just the first time when you take them out and throw them at your players? And that's why I propose them for curses. They should be like one-time things that are like, oh yeah, that is how they work, and then you're done. I hope you got something interesting or useful out of it, or at least like the baseline I'm okay with is you just having little thoughts bubble up. That's the goal of what I'm trying to do here. It would be very cool if you write your own ideas for these crazy curses and conditions and stuff down in the comments for everyone to use. And yeah, I hope to see you in the next one, but until then I bid you
farewell, keepers.